Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for learning with Switchboard. Really glad to be back with you for this webinar, Foundations of Mandatory Reporting, which is one of our most popular offerings here at Switchboard. I'm Maya Varman. I'm a licensed social worker in the state of New Jersey with a master's of social work from Rutgers. I have over a decade of experience and work with immigrants and refugees. I've been in direct service and resettlement settings and other immigrant services where I've had to make several mandatory reports and follow up with child protective services and clients to make sure they're safe and cared for. Also, when I was in my social work degree, I had a lot of folks in my cohort who were longtime employees for Child Protective Services here in New Jersey. And I learned a lot from them, but also really enjoyed talking about the cultural aspects of working with newcomers in this field. So, really excited to talk about this with you all. This can be some difficult stuff, so please take care of yourself as you need to. It can also be so supportive and impactful for families. So that's why we're all here today. I'm grateful you took the time to join us, whether this is a refresher for you or the content is brand new. Thank you to Rebecca and Jasmine, my colleagues on the back end, producing this webinar, answering your questions, and providing links and information in the chat. I do want to highlight briefly that since we last ran this webinar, we have a new toolkit on mandatory reporting that has sample scripts and lots of recommended resources you can reference. You can feel free to open it and follow it throughout the webinar. It'll also be in the recommended resources slide at the end. We also, a couple of years ago, did publish an info guide that accompanies this webinar if it's helpful for you to have this in written format. So before we get into our learning objectives, I do want to highlight that this webinar can get you 1.5 Association of Social Work Boards approved continuing education credits. These can be used to maintain your existing licensure. Make sure you stay for the entire event. And we'll give very detailed instructions at the end to complete the quick assessment and surveys for your free CEs from Switchboard. We always get questions on whether this will meet a specific state requirement on mandatory reporting. And this is a general presentation. It does not go into any state specifics, but you can check with your state licensing board or your specific organization to see if it would meet any training requirements on this topic. So by the end of this introductory session, you will be able to describe key principles of mandatory reporting and reportable situations such as abuse and neglect of children and vulnerable adults, identify who may be a mandatory reporter and possible steps of the reporting process, integrate special considerations for working across cultures with newcomers in the mandatory reporting context, and apply client-centered and trauma-informed principles to maintain client confidentiality and trust while upholding mandatory reporting responsibilities. So that's a lot. We're going to dive right in and first start by defining some basic terms and principles of abuse, neglect, and mandatory reporting. It's really important before we do that to make very clear that abuse and neglect do not discriminate. All clients are susceptible, all people are susceptible. There are studies that show that abuse and neglect happen across all socioeconomic statuses, across different communities, be they religious or racial, whatever it is. Violence does unfortunately exist in all communities and social sectors. And abuse can be inflicted by anyone, not just a person responsible for the child's or vulnerable adult's care, custody, and control. So we're going to have a few case scenarios. We've taken care to represent different communities in that we are not singling out any group. These could happen in any client community and in any situation. So it's really important for us to say that. So to define a mandated reporter, they have an individual duty to report known or suspected abuse or neglect relating to children, elders, or dependent adults. So usually the term mandated reporter is most often associated with people who have responsibility to report suspected child abuse, but it can, depending on your state and context, also mean you're mandated to report on the abuse of adults, of elderly folks, dependent adults, and adults with disabilities. So, to that end, about whom might you be reporting, it really does depend on your state laws. But the general guidelines that children under 18, you're going to be a mandatory reporter for that. Vulnerable adults of any age, so those with any emotional or physical impairment who can't protect themselves or have self determination, and elderly adults over 65 who have specific vulnerabilities as well. This is any child or vulnerable adult, not just clients. So if you fall into the category of mandated reporter, which we'll get into, if you witness or know of the abuse of any child or vulnerable adult, you do need to report. And anyone can report, even if they're not state mandated. So everyone, you can tell your friends to watch this training or just give the information that everyone should feel empowered that anyone can make a report if this information gets to them that there's been abuse or neglect. Why report? It's really part of our integral responsibility as case managers and service providers. We have a duty to do no harm and make sure that no harm, as much as we can manage it, happens kind of under our watch or certainly not with our knowledge. We are in this work, we have the imperative to serve and protect the most vulnerable. And we know that there are really harmful impacts of abuse, neglect, and abandonment on clients and communities. And those radiate outwards when people have experienced trauma and harm. It hurts more than just them. It really radiates outward in the community. So not reporting is serious. It can leave or inflict further damage in communities that are already vulnerable. So it's really important that you're here. Let's define abuse, which is any physical, sexual, or emotional injury inflicted on another person other than by accidental means. It's important to say that in some states, witnessing interpersonal violence can be construed as abuse, even if it's between the adults in the home, but the children witness it. And that can still have an negative impact on the child, even if it's not a mandated reporting abuse definition in your state. So it's something to keep in mind that can be tricky to navigate. If it can be a little difficult to think about accidents, because if there's a kind of situation in which children are being abused accidentally, but in a pattern, that might no longer be an accident. It might be the kind of terms in which the situation in which they're being abused, which also leads us to our second definition of neglect, which is when a caregiver consistently fails to meet the basic needs of a child or vulnerable adult, such as adequate food, shelter, clothing, medical care, or supervision, which includes, physical and emotional safety. The absence of resources due to poverty does not constitute neglect. And we're going to get a little bit more into how we can kind of differentiate those, especially when we're mandated to report neglect of children and vulnerable adults. So you can learn about this through disclosure, which we'll talk about in a moment, or through witnessing other indicators. But disclosure is when a client tells you directly about abuse or neglect. They can tell you on purpose or accidentally let it slip. They didn't need to tell you, or they can say, hey, Maya, I really need to talk to you about something serious. It can also be about themselves. It can be self-disclosure or another person, whether that's a sibling, a friend, someone else in their household. But it's not, we're not always looking for disclosure necessarily, or that's not the only way to learn about abuse or neglect. We might witness abuse or neglect and see indicators. And we'll talk about this more, but we never want to force a disclosure or force someone to tell us. We're going to talk about how to respond kindly and professionally to disclosure. But now we'll look at some indicators of abuse, how to check in with clients if they seem to be harmed or in trouble, or neglected. So some indicators of physical abuse. If you see someone who has unexplained burns, bites, bruises, broken bones, or black eyes, fading bruises or marks that are noticeable after an absence from school or work, frequently wearing clothing that's not seasonal to cover their bodies, they're withdrawn or aggressive, there's sudden changes in their extreme behaviors. If they're frightened of their parents, they're protesting, crying when it's time for them to go home. they start shrinking at the approach of adults, or they have strange explanation of their injuries. So, physical abuse can range from minor bruises to severe fractures or death. It's the result of punching, beating, kicking, biting, shaking, throwing, stabbing, any way that you can kind of hurt another human being, burning them, with tools. And if it's inflicted by anyone who has kind of control over the child or vulnerable adult. These injuries are considered abuse regardless of whether the caregiver intended to hurt the child. Indicators of sexual abuse: if someone has difficulty walking or sitting, shows pain or swelling in the genital area, so has nightmares or is bedwetting, there's a sudden change in appetite, sexual knowledge or behavior that are not age appropriate or development appropriate, sudden extreme behavior changes or secretive behavior, if they're suddenly pregnant or contract some kind of venereal disease, sexually transmitted infection, especially if they're under 14, frequent urinary or yeast infections, and drug or alcohol abuse or attempted suicide, especially with older youth. So these are some of these indicators. With emotional or psychological abuse, that's a pattern of behavior that denigrates a child's emotional development and sense of self-worth. So that could be constant criticisms, threats, rejection, withholding love, support, or guidance. Unfortunately, it's often more difficult to prove, and Child Protective Services may not be able to intervene without evidence of harm or trauma to the child. It's also very likely present in any of these other kinds of abuse. So it might be kind of a co-occurring abuse. But if a child or a vulnerable adult is showing extremes in behavior, is either inappropriately adult, like parenting other children, or inappropriately infantile, frequent rocking or head banging, if they're delayed somehow in physical or emotional development, if they're showing psychosomatic symptoms, so illness that isn't explained by other medical conditions, if they report a total lack of attachment to their parent or caregiver, or unfortunately, if they've attempted suicide, and that's more often in adolescence. So pretty much in any case of abuse, you're going to have some kind of sign of emotional or psychological abuse, particularly in those physical and sexual abuse. So that's an indicator as well as its own kind of abuse. It could also, psychological abuse include financial abuse, if especially with vulnerable adults, if someone is controlling your finances so they can't function or act independently or take care of themselves. And that might tie into trafficking, which we'll talk about in a moment. The possibility of neglect includes abandonment, stealing or hoarding food, being frequently absent from school, has difficulty staying awake in school, consistently inappropriately dressed for the weather, exhibiting poor hygiene and severe body odor, lacks needed medical or dental care, immunization, or glasses, reports there's no one at home to provide care. If other children in the family show similar behaviors, it can be neglecting their medical condition or their education. Again, we'll get back to how that might intersect with some indicators of poverty or different cultural factors and how we parse through that. In this world, there's a lot of risk of online abuse and technology facilitated abuse. So like child sexual abuse that's offline, online child exploitation is most likely perpetrated by someone the child knows and cares about. Some indicators are unexplained gifts, money, game subscriptions. The child is presenting themselves as older online. They're sending revealing photos or videos of themselves, or they become secretive. They're always minimizing screens or hiding their devices. Finally, we're going to touch briefly on trafficking, which is not the center of today's presentation. And we have a lot of resources here at Switchboard, as well as our colleagues at Framework, which I really recommend you look up if you want to learn more about trafficking. But in broad strokes, there's two types: labor trafficking and sex trafficking. It's the coercion of folks to engage in commercial sexual acts or other labor acts. Traffickers recruit, entice, transport, provide, or obtain people for forced labor or sex, um, or patronize or solicit sex from someone non-consensually. Please note a child under 18 cannot give consent for commercial sex acts. So commercial sex acts for children under 18 are automatically trafficking. There absolutely can be an overlap of sex and labor trafficking. They're not two distinct things. And it's important if you're making a report to specify if you think there's commercial styled sex exploitation. Victims may be eligible for other state or federal services and assistance. There's also a separate hotline, which is in that toolkit that Jasmine dropped in the chat. You can contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children or the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. And so I encourage you, if this is something you're worried about or you have interest in, to please learn more through Switchboard and Framework. So now we're going to go into some general mandatory reporting guidelines. What are the roles? What are the laws that we know about, again, in a general capacity, not in your own state, and the process? So who is a mandated reporter? If you're directly serving refugees and newcomers, which brought you to this webinar, you're most likely a mandated reporter. So it's good you're here. Some states may also include staff or volunteers that provide organized activities for children. So coaches, teachers, other probable mandatory reporters, social workers, doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers, teachers and school personnel, camp counselors, foster parents. So a lot of people actually fall under this umbrella. And if in your state volunteers are considered mandatory reporters, we encourage you to work with them to learn about these guidelines. Supervisors or paid staff can always support volunteers in making reports, but if they're the mandated reporter, they need to make the report directly. So our role as a mandated reporter is to make that report, which we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. It's also to support the person who's being abused or neglected, or the family, providing non-judgmental care, and to connect them to resources and support. Our role is not to investigate, and this is really important. We want to be aware and observe if we see those indicators or if we are disclosed to, but we're not always seeking disclosure. We're not investigating and finding out exactly what happened and what needs to happen next. We are there to support the family and then make that report. So with that, we'll go to our first case scenario. Meet Malik and Amira. Malik is 5, Amira is 7. They're siblings in a family from Sudan that arrived a year ago. The family has completed their initial resettlement services, including their cultural orientation. You are running an after-school program at your agency, and you have enrolled Malik and Amira. When they come to their first session, you notice each of them has a few visible bruises on their arms and legs. When you ask about the bruises, Malik stares at you and cries silently, while Amira says, "It's nothing," and avoids your gaze. So we're going to be using Slido in today's presentation. You can scan that QR code or go to slido.com and put in the number on the screen. I'd love to hear from you. What would be your next step in this case? See folks typing. Talk to your supervisor, especially if this is the first time you've encountered this kind of thing. Make a report. Talk to your boss, discuss with your colleague. Report, not alarm or stress the children any further, and convene leadership and supervision. Love that supportive answer. Report what you see, case note it, and talk to your supervisor. I think our summary is that this is a reportable situation, and that's something we're going to need to do soon. You absolutely should tell your supervisor and seek support from them, especially if it's your first time doing a report. Also thinking about how we're going to support the kids, not traumatizing it further and them further. And And so we'll get into that supportive piece after we kind of make the report. Yeah, you might want to intervene with the parents. It maybe depends on the situation and how safe that feels. And we're going to talk some about that. Talking with your coworker, if there's someone working with the children and they want to co-make the report with you, or you need some advice, that might be a good idea. But we also want to be cognizant of sensitive information and not pulling in more people to a sensitive, situation than we need to. But these are really great. We want to make sure that uh, we want to make sure that we're really, supporting the children as well. And we want to emphasize in this training that pretty much all of you are likely mandated reporters. So you're not going to talk to your coworker so they'll report. You need to make that report if you've kind of been the first one to witness, but absolutely getting support from your supervisor. So great work. So we're going to talk next about the mandatory reporting process. And you can keep in mind, Malik and Amira, imagine what going through the process in their case would look like, or you can imagine it with a case you're currently working with if relevant, or if you've made a report recently. So first, you're going to determine if you have reasonable suspicion to make a report. Then you will make the report with your local state abuse and neglect agency. Excuse me. Then you're going to follow up with the authorities and support the clients when you're able. So first, determining if you have reasonable suspicion to make a report. Keep in mind those indicators that we talked about, or if there's the disclosure. When are you legally mandated to report? If you have reasonable cause to suspect child abuse or neglect, also known as reasonable suspicion. So with the facts and circumstances that you don't, again, need to investigate or spend much time gathering information. It's okay, I have that reasonable cause. I'm going to report and support the client. If you observe directly a child being subjected to circumstances reasonably resulting in abuse or neglect, so again, think about those indicators, then your report must be direct and immediate to the child abuse and neglect agency or hotline in your state municipality. So there is a time expectation that you do this immediately. If there's an immediate or imminent danger, so, can't wait a few minutes or, 30 minutes to make the report, be on the phone, call 911 before making a report. Whenever you make a report, you do not need all the facts, just what has come to your attention. And don't assume or try to answer things you don't know. It's totally okay to just say, I don't know. You should make a report even if Child Protective Services is already involved with the family or knows of a situation. You don't know if they have all the details or if this is an escalation. If you hear it from a third party, someone else discloses, you should still make the report with the information you have available to you, again, without doing much investigation. If the allegation or suspicion involves a colleague or coworker, you absolutely should make a report and maybe consult with a supervisor or someone safe within your agency on how to move forward. Really, you want to err on the side of reporting, even with third-party information. Ensure the report has been made in the best interest of the child, and that also reduces your own liability. So if someone discloses to you, you can use this acronym of I care. The information. Gather the information you've been given, but don't investigate. Don't make someone repeat a disclosure. What you heard, that's going to be enough. You can maybe ask some soft follow-ups, but you're not trying to probe. You're not a detective. Try to stay calm. Take a breath, listen, answer their questions honestly. And that means, not saying things that might sound nice, but aren't necessarily true. We'll talk a little bit about this. That comes along with assuring the clients, reminding them that you can handle the information, that maybe you've been through a mandatory reporting training, that you're proactive, that you're glad that they talked to you. Have a script. Again, that toolkit that we shared has some great scripts. I think it's really helpful to actually practice these before you have to use them in real life, because this can be a stressful situation. Then we're going to report, so that our contacting the appropriate agency or hotline directly and immediately. Then we're going to overall support the client and encourage policies, environments that prioritize client safety. So that's before the report, thinking about how we're supporting client safety during a reporting process and after the report is made. So, okay, so we're going to focus on that R for a moment, making the report. Who do I report to and how do I find state resources? Again, these are all listed in the ways that you can find them in that toolkit that we shared. If you supervise or direct an agency, have your specific state and localities reporting hotlines and resources readily available to staff and volunteers. So you can search the Child Welfare Information Gateway by state, which there's a link we'll also drop into the chat here. You can search through the National Adult Protective Services Association or the American Bar Association. They have state by state guidance. You can go to your state's Department of Human Services website or office. They may have mandatory reporting resources, or you can just look for free training in your state by searching your state's name and free mandatory reporter training. There's a lot of resources available, and we want to make sure that you're finding what's right for your context and your locality. Mandatory reporters also have protections, not only responsibilities. So some of the safeguards are that employers can't prevent or discourage reporting and they can't retaliate. So no supervisor or administrator can inhibit you from making a report. You can't be subject to any sanction or penalty or adverse employment action. Any employee required to report has to have immediate and unrestricted access to a phone or whatever communication technology, and must be temporarily relieved of other work duties while making the report. Not making the report can put clients at risk of harm, and it can be really badly liable to you or your agency if abuse or neglect was known of and not reported directly. So keep in mind it's time sensitive. Consult with your supervisor, as so many of you said in the Slido. If you're in doubt or if you have questions about how to make the report, you have to make the report themselves, but they can be present or support you. Mandatory reporters have immunity. They're legally protected, even if the report comes out, that nothing was needed to be investigated further. Anyone making a report in good faith is immune from liability. And mandatory reporters are guaranteed confidentiality. Reporter identity and report content remains confidential. Only the investigators know it. That can't be shared with the people involved. They say who reported us. That's not something that the agency will ever share. So what should you expect when you call? The agency or hotline worker will ask questions to try to get the information they need to further investigate and support. That might include the name of the person, the name of the parents or caregivers, the name of the alleged abuser, if that's not the same as the parents or caregivers, where they can be located, whether it's at home or if they're in some kind of camp or school or institution. Other concerns or helpful information, it's really helpful to say, they're newcomers, they're refugees, they're need language interpretation, that kind of thing. Again, you don't need every detail to make the call. Just provide the above information and whatever else they ask to the best of your ability. Don't assume if you don't know other things. You can say, I don't know. So afterwards, what does follow-up look like with authorities? And how do we support the client when we're able? So a lot of you said this in the Slido, you're going to need to document the situation and the fact that you made a report and safeguard that information. When you're on the phone, ask for a case number from the person you've made the report to. You're going to want to work with your agency as well and your supervisor to safeguard sensitive information, including your own information. So how are we keeping it safe in case notes? So only the people who really need it are privy. If you have a release of information, you can follow up with the Child Protective Services or Adult Protective Services for updates or next steps. And you're going to want to support the client with referrals and any assistance, advocacy, and safety planning. So we'll come back to that piece, but it's important to say this is absolutely a part of reporting. In terms of the report, what happens next? The investigating agency will examine the report and screen for urgency and severity. Investigators will likely visit within 1 to 3 days. They may determine there's no need for further investigation, but there'll always be a record of the report if something else comes up. And again, reporter information is never shared with the alleged perpetrator or family members of the children. And I want to emphasize here that our role is, we have this shared goal of supporting children, families, and vulnerable adults. Um, and we want to work with whatever investigating agency is that has the mandate and the expertise to try to support families in their own way and provide support and advocacy as well, in whatever ways we need, whether that's advocating for language interpretation or supporting the family, or if something is not going right, to try to advocate for and with them. But again, we're working with an agency that their mandate and expertise is how to investigate and keep vulnerable people safe. And we're also working with vulnerable people with a different kind of mandate and expertise. And ideally, we're all working in concert to support our communities. So with that, we're going to go into what some special considerations about working with newcomers in mandatory reporting might actually look like. So we have another Slido here. This is a word cloud. I'd love to hear from you. What are some considerations in mandatory reporting with refugee clients from different cultural backgrounds? And because it's a word cloud, if you put in the same answer as someone else, it'll grow bigger. You can emphasize it in that way. So would love to hear this from you. All right. Considering language barriers, absolutely. Religion, understanding differences, language access, describing cultural expectations. Traditional norms, prior trauma history, their literacy, if you're providing written notification of these practices, but they can't read, considering gender, considering their knowledge of US law. People are fearful, absolutely. Differing cultural practices, education level, cultural differences and cultural norms, values and beliefs about parenting. Absolutely. Prior trauma history, if I didn't say that already, that's a really important one as well. Familiarity with how law enforcement works in the US, respecting culture and religion, the client's rights and responsibilities. These are really, really important. And hopefully we'll touch on a lot of these when we think about some of these special considerations. Differences between assimilated children and non-assimilated parents. So generational differences based on when migration happened or how people are experiencing their migration. So thank you so much for contributing in this way. So let's talk about some risk factors that newcomers face. There may be a lot of differences in child welfare and how other government systems interact with families here and where they came from. The entire notion of a child welfare system may be foreign to the family or how that works. That can lead to conflict or gray areas. We know that unfortunately all newcomers and really all immigrants have all kinds of risk factors for harm, trauma, and vulnerability. And the risk factors for trauma and perpetuating violence are kind of the same risk factors or overlapping risk factors with experiencing child abuse and neglect. So Unfortunately, we know that violence often begets violence, and people who have witnessed or experienced violence, not everyone, of course, but there can be a risk factor to perpetuate violence in the home or in the community. Also, having a lack of resources or poverty, lack of education and knowledge about these things can be risk factors for um, abuse and neglect, as well as isolation, societal marginalization, or lack of community support. So some of these ways that either lack of resources and poverty or isolation can contribute, if newcomers live in dangerous neighborhoods with risks of violence or trafficking and they feel isolated, they feel they don't have other options than to, succumb to some kind of abuse or neglect. Um, and unfamiliarity with the laws, what is legal in this country around discipline, around leaving children at home alone, not knowing these practices can be punishable by law or social stigma. So those can be risk factors as well. And thinking about cultural factors as well in terms of trafficking. If a child is expected to get a job and work hard and contribute financially to the family quickly, they may be vulnerable to exploitation because of their young age. They may be able to be manipulated or pressured to perform. Gender roles and expectations can render children vulnerable to trafficking as well. So there are a lot of risk factors we want to keep in mind, not to judge the risk factor, but to support families in mitigating those risk factors and preventing child abuse and neglect. When we're serving clients from different cultures, remembering that culture shapes the way family and children are members are raised and treated, and identifying and nurturing cultural strengths, beliefs, and practices of those individuals in the family, and integrating that knowledge into our plan to protect the child or vulnerable adult. So it's really important to spend a few moments here. I want to share a famous case in 1997. There was a Danish mother in New York City who left her child out in a stroller outside of a restaurant because she went to dine in the restaurant. 911 was called and the child welfare authorities were involved. This was a very drawn out court case, and this mother was baffled in her Danish culture, leaving a child outside the restaurant to breathe fresh air, and knowing that in Denmark, others on the street would look out, would watch, and make sure the well being of the child was okay. That was considered acceptable. And not only that, but preferable to bringing a child into a crowded restaurant where people might be smoking. And she had no idea she was engaging in criminal behavior. She truly thought she was doing the best thing for her baby. I really love sharing this scenario or this anecdote in this training because this is a Western European cultural difference. It breaks stereotypes that are important to break, that only non-Western or non-white cultures have practices that in the US might be considered child abuse and neglect. On the surface, this person might look totally assimilated, but they have found this huge contradiction between U.S. law and child caring values or practices with their own. So factor in that we're working with lots of different kinds of cultures and cultures that are farther removed sometimes from the US culture. A few examples in Liberian culture, children are raised much more communally. So having neighbors look out for your children, letting them roam in the neighborhood alone, it's considered not only acceptable, but healthy, better for the child to let your child kind of be raised by that village. If you've watched the show on Netflix Old Enough, which my husband and I love, you can see Japanese parents sending their toddlers to cross busy streets and into town alone to perform tasks. And that's because that rite of passage is really important in their culture in helping the child grow up and learn responsibility. And also, others around the children know that toddlers are going to be coming into their supermarket. They're going to help them cross the road. They're going to help them count out their money and carry the errands home. So when there's a communal culture where that is acceptable and venerated, it's safe. But it's not considered safe or acceptable in the US to do that. And so that might be reportable. Again, it's not out of malintent necessarily from the parents. It's out of good intent, but it might need to shift once they're in the US, subject to US laws and regulations. Culture shapes the way that children are raised and treated. Think about family sleep habits. So I was shocked in my social work cohort to hear a child protection professional say, you should never co-sleep. And I thought to my family, where people have co-slept for generations, meaning sharing a bed with a child. So thinking about what the safety mitigations are with that, with a culture, with what a family is comfortable with. There might be alternate forms of medicine, including religious or spiritual healing, imbibing of, uh, you know, different substances or alcohol if it's for a religious occasion. Also, of course, thinking about discipline, spanking, how a lot of times in the past or in different places, corporal discipline was to help keep children safe historically from dangerous areas or from being abused by others. But now, if there's more safety, we need to follow US laws and state laws around what it means to discipline children physically, any rites of passage that may change or disfigure the body, again, drinking substances or other things. So these are just some different examples that could become gray areas or make us think what is considered abuse and neglect. And because of that, we really want to identify and nurture the cultural strengths, beliefs, and practices of the family. How could you encourage communal raising of in the community, like that Liberian culture, while emphasizing that in this country, children need to be attended to, that there's laws around that? How can you praise families like those Japanese families and Old Enough for giving their children opportunities to learn responsibility and grow while educating them about community safety laws in this country, about crossing the street, about going out alone? And how could you work with the strengths of that Danish family of wanting the child to have fresh air while explaining what the law is and community safety, that people in the US are not necessarily primed to look in on a baby in a stroller and make sure they're okay? However, if the cultural practice falls within the legal definitions of abuse or neglect, it must be reported. And so this is where our role of supporting before a report, before abuse and neglect, is really important. We want to give proactive education in cultural orientation as we're teaching families through different health programs, as we're getting them oriented to schools, in client intake. These are the things to keep in mind. What are the cultural practices that would be reportable that the client should know of ahead of time before we have the situation? So big ones are that small children can't be left alone at home here, or that corporal punishment is not permitted, particularly if it leaves physical traces on the body. We want to try to provide that education early and often to avoid these situations whenever possible. So let's go to our next case scenario. We'll spend a little bit of time with this one. You are taking a recently arrived Venezuelan family to a local Spanish-speaking church to connect them to their community. As you drop off the family, their 8-year-old son is not listening to his parents' request to get out of the car. The situation escalates, and you witness the father strike the child's cheek with his hand. The church's pastor also witnesses the interaction. As the family enters, he takes you aside and asks that you not report the incident, citing cultural norms and explaining that the family is new to this country. So going back to Slido, think first, how might you respond to the pastor? And the case scenarios in the chat for your reference. Give you a couple moments to think about that. Lots of typing, so that's great. Have you seen this happen in the family before? How well do you know the family? So finding out, is this a pattern or a one-time thing? Explain to them your mandatory reporting status and you're required to report what you saw, explaining, I'm a mandated reporter. I need to make this report. I understand their different cultural perspectives. I'm legally obligated to report. He might be a mandatory reporter too. With clergy and religious leaders, sometimes there is certain confidentiality, but ultimately protecting those vulnerable populations is likely to be um, in their purview. And so you need to make a report. You hope that he makes a report. Discuss the importance of orienting the family. I'm mandated to report, even though it's a cultural practice. Ask him to sit down with the parents, discuss alternate ways of discipline. So um, uh, even if you are mandated to report, you can still support the family. Making a report doesn't mean that you're against the family. You're all trying to support the family in following the laws and keeping their children safe. My assessment of whether to report depends on actions rather than intent. But of course, I will pair this with education for the family. So letting the family know or the pastor know, I need to report this, but I want to support so that the intent of, even if the intent is good, to how can we better kind of support our children under this context? Absolutely. The family should be informed in orientation. Unfortunately, these things do happen even after orientation. So giving information early and often. Um, if he's doing this in public, who knows what's happening at home? I think it's a really good point that we don't know if there's worse things happening at home, and we can't make assumptions, kind of good or bad. We've seen what we've seen, and it's reportable. So these are really great. So let's continue with this case scenario. You have thanked the pastor for his perspective. When you return to your office, you make the report. You later schedule time to speak to the family to educate them on disciplinary practices that are accepted in the US. So, all these things you've talked about. The next time you drop the family off at the church, the pastor confronts you, upset that the family was reported. The report was anonymous, but the family told him they were contacted by the local child protective services. So, how would you navigate this situation? Be lots of thinking minds. So, we'll take a look here. It is difficult to navigate. I appreciate you naming that. This is not easy. Okay. Tell the pastor you're a mandated reporter, that you did what you were required to do. I would feel afraid or ashamed to go back. So if you already mentioned to the pastor that you're a mandated reporter, you certainly could say, this was my job, but I'm still supporting the family. I'm going to provide education. If you didn't say to the pastor that you're a reporter, you can just say, someone noticed a difficult behavior in this situation, and it's their obligation to report. You don't actually have to own the fact that it was you if that feels unsafe in that moment. But saying I did my due diligence, um, I'm not required to say anything, that you can't discuss the situation further. I think that is really important too, that there's confidentiality around your relationship with the family and anything you might know or not know about this report, so that that's private information that you're not at liberty to discuss with the pastor. Be very clear and succinct with the facts of the situation. Um, yeah, so I think it partly depends on if you have another kind of relationship with the pastor, or if you've worked with him already to support this family, or if it's kind of a one-off, but you're not under any obligation to disclose that you were report. But you could also say exactly as someone said, the child's safety is paramount. This was my responsibility, and um, uh, I'm committed to supporting this family. And that, maybe the pastor should consider how to keep folks safe, if he's a mandated reporter himself. So through that, we'll go to the next slide. How can you continue to support the family? How can you ensure that you're still there for the family? That this is not, um, uh, you know, you're not an antagonist to them, that you're trying to work towards similar goals. And we'll get into this more in section 4, but would love to hear from you in this situation. Check in with them. What resources can they utilize? What can they learn? How can you support them in that? In education, providing thorough case management, what cultural orientation can we brush up on? Being friendly, I think being professional, saying, this is a red line, but I understand that you care about your children, if you feel that's the case. And how can I support you in changing this so that you're adhering with the law and supporting your children and keeping them safe? Yeah, I think in this situation, it's unlikely the kids would be taken away without, a severe escalation. But explaining to a family that with many child abuse reports, they could risk to lose children, and so that the stakes are high to kind of learn and correct this behavior so that they can adhere to safety practices in this country. Being honest, expressing my intent to continue to support them, absolutely, and educating the family what's going on. If they come to you, again, you don't have to disclose that you were the reporter, but you can still support them. Okay, the investigators are coming. How can you better the situation? Yeah, conducting cultural orientation again to reinstate what we've initially been told the rules and regulations and laws toward everyone individually, including the kids. It was a mistake from the beginning. I don't think she'll be able to help them as there will be a trust issue. That is not kind of following the U.S. law, but I hear what you're saying, and it's possible that they might receive that message better. From someone else or connecting them to other cultural resources in which they can talk through this. There's lots of different ways to broach this. You don't have to be the sole educator or provider of cultural orientation. Um, yeah, I think, like all of us, Child Protective Services can be overburdened with a lot of reports. And in some ways, we kind of have to trust that the investigation will happen in the order of urgency and severity that it's reported. But following up, asking to speak to a manager, at a child protective service agency or a supervisor to try and support families who aren't getting the support that they need. Referring to parenting classes in our organization. We keep trying. No single one of us is fully responsible for the safety and well-being of any of our clients or any one family or person, but we engage in mandatory reporting and we do this work to try to support as best we can. So these are really great answers. And I appreciate that you're engaging with the nuance and complexity. These are not easy things to do or to navigate. So in the interest of time, we're going to move forward. I want to talk about distinguishing poverty from neglect. So I remember when I was in high school and I was supporting a young neighbor's birthday party, kind of like as a counselor. And I heard a wealthier parent say, I can't believe, some parents let their kids wait outside alone for the school bus. That's so neglectful. And I was a child who always waited for the school bus. When my older sister was home, she would wait with me. And when she went to college, it was just me. And that is not considered neglectful in the US. We have school buses to help transport children to school. So sometimes what can be kind of considered neglect may be actually a sense of perspective. There's a lot of privilege to say, well, I drive my children to school, but what if you don't have the time because of work or a car? They may not have other options. This is an officially sanctioned public service. And I again grew up as a school bus kid. I did not grow up in poverty or in neglect. So thinking about how are we looking and judging at other families and their practices, and how are we supporting the strengths and resources that that family is using to be in a safe and good situation? I see you're struggling with a resource, but you are caring for your child. How can I help you find that resource? So what this means is that poverty is when a caregiver does not have the resources to provide for the need, even though they want to. Neglect is when the caregiver has the resources but chooses not to provide for the need. So connecting families to resources is really the heart of our service provision work. It's the heart of case management. We're responsible to proactively connect families, to educate them, and to avoid the negative consequences of poverty, which does not constitute neglect. If a family comes from a warm country and they don't have warm clothes and it's the dead of winter, how can we quickly address this situation so that it's not neglectful? We're addressing the core issue of the poverty. We're often really, even though we're also mandated reporters, we're in the position to first be effective supporters. Um, how do we connect kids to childcare resources, to home visiting programs, to medical and mental health support, to material needs? So we really do want to link families to resources. We also know that it doesn't take the place of reporting if there's abuse or neglect. So we're trying to mitigate the negative consequences of poverty, but report if a caregiver has resources and chooses not to provide or is withholding from the child or vulnerable adult for malicious reasons. Want to touch on interactions with authorities or child welfare. Many refugees have deep fears of law enforcement and systems, especially child welfare authorities. Figures in uniform might trigger PTSD in clients who've had encounters with militants, who have been deeply abused by their governments in the past, where there was kidnapping of children. Child protection might be seen as a way to take children away or infiltrate a family with bad government actors. And we want to try to support families in understanding that child welfare authorities in this country are separate from other law enforcement authorities and are there to share the same objective of keeping children safe and well. As well, in many refugees' cultural contexts, exercising one's rights with authorities is unfamiliar or fear inducing. So, I had an Eritrean client who received his food stamps determination, which was positive, and there was a whole document at the end of the bundle in the mail that said, you know, you have the right to appeal this decision. And he looked at me and said, I'm allowed to argue with the government? And I said, yes, absolutely. And that was really novel to him. So I want you to think about what are the ways that clients might not know they have rights, even if they're under investigation or that they feel like those rights are being taken away. Even volunteers from your agency might be seen as kind of being in a position of power that folks are beholden to them. So when it's possible and it's safe, think about how you can advocate for cultural responsiveness and effective interpretation. If the investigators show up without an interpreter, how can you help the family advocate for the fact that they need an interpreter to talk through the investigation or they need other culturally responsive services? Really importantly, as much as you can, stay impartial when you're reporting. We all hold, prejudices or implicit biases that we're not aware of. um, Even when we're unaware, they can guide our decision making about whether to report. So we want to recognize any stereotypes or untrue assumptions that we have. Again, we started the training with the disclaimer that abuse and neglect don't discriminate. So it can happen in any community. We want to try to look and be kind of as fair as possible. Keep reflecting on your reactions. Um, and you are probably in a state of somewhat elevated fear or concern if someone's disclosed to you or if you've witnessed abuse or neglect. Take a moment, do that C calm of a disclosure and I care. Take a breath. Try to think, have you examined the strengths of the situation, not only the risks? Acknowledge and accept your worry about danger. That's a good thing that you care about people, about this family, but also what are you maybe missing because you're in that elevated state of concern? What are the other strengths or protective factors in that situation? And we want to just keep practicing cultural responsiveness. So some ways to identify strengths and not kind of get caught up only in an emotional reaction. Thinking about if can you stick to facts instead of opinions or emotionally charged or judgmental language. So instead of saying in a case note or in the investigation the caregiver was cruel, maybe the caregiver shouted at the child and called them worthless in my presence. So you're removing some of that judgment and trying to give the information to in a report that can help protect the child. But being culturally responsive and thinking about how culture interacts with folks, and how they're raising their children, how they're taking care of vulnerable adults or the elderly, that helps us achieve greater consistency in reporting practices. So, not reporting as much on certain kinds of populations or people, and ultimately improves outcomes for all children and vulnerable adults. So finally, we're going to discuss how can we maintain client confidentiality and trust through the mandatory reporting process. Really trying to emphasize in this presentation that mandatory reporting is a form of client support. It is not in opposition to client support. So what are the ways that this is supportive of clients? We have our shared goals of safety and wellness. We are trying to care for the family's welfare. As we know, so many immigrant, refugee, newcomer parents who come to this country, I had so many clients tell me this, say they're doing it for their children, for a better life, more safety, security, wellness, better education for their children. And uh, and we want to emphasize that mandatory reporting is part of that, that we have these shared goals, and so do the child welfare authorities. So this is all part of us working together to keep families safe. We're also thinking about cultural adjustment. How do we help families learn new norms, not judging why it happened necessarily, as we talked about in the previous case, but rather how can we help you learn a different way of doing it that's safer and legal in this country? And also, mandatory reporting is a part of strengths-based work that families have the ability to learn and change. Parents have the ability to change how they treat their children, to learn new things, that we're not foregoing that and saying, you did this, it's bad, but just how can we change this and make this a better situation? Again, connecting families to resources and supporting them in a strengths-based and culturally responsive way. This is really the heart of refugee resettlement. And that's why mandatory reporting is supportive of children, helping them understand we're all kind of working together. So when to discuss general mandatory reporting with clients, when you're having initial client meetings, you're building rapport, um, you want to say, there's a few things legally I can't keep confidential. It's to help protect vulnerable people. If I learn of abuse or neglect of a child or vulnerable adult, it's important to give this information early and often. So again, with client rights and responsibilities. Again, if there's a refresh or a re-signing of privacy practices, that these are certain things I cannot keep confidential, with ongoing reminders if needed. Now, there was an important question that came up in the Q&A, a couple. One being, am I required to tell a family that I've reported? Absolutely not, especially if you think it would make you unsafe. We're going to go through some of the advantages and disadvantages of telling a client you're reporting or involving them in that report. But it is important to let clients know that you are a mandatory reporter, that most things that you talk about with them are confidential, but not when it comes to mandatory reporting. And it's kind of better to do that again early and often and in a theoretical way so that they know that information ahead of time. We do have sample scripts in that toolkit of how to talk with clients about this ahead of time and how to answer questions they might have. So let's go to our next case scenario. Johanna and Gert are an Afrikaner couple with 3 children, Willem, Marijke, and Jaco. Willem is 6, Marijke is 3, and Jaco is 1. Gert works long hours far from home. One of your volunteers has been asked to pick up Johanna for her employment intake at the agency office. As the volunteer and Johanna leave the house, Johanna reminds the kids that the neighbors will be keeping an eye on them until she returns. The volunteer feels uncomfortable leaving the children behind, but she does not have appropriate car safety seats to bring them along. When the volunteer brings Johanna to the office, she tells you about the kids at home, so you decide to take Johanna home after the appointment to see for yourself. It is after dark and the kids are home alone. So again, would love to hear from you in Slido. What are some steps you could take? Reminding what are the laws regarding leaving kids at home alone, making sure they really know that and that they're responsible to follow those. Absolutely. Explaining the rules. Good. A lot of education. Assessing the house for other safety, how to consider childcare. Are there childcare supports that are available if since the kids can't be left alone? Talking about other support, who else might be able to watch the kids because they can't be left alone. Ask if it happens often. Finding resources to find car seats, absolutely, so the kids can come to appointments if that's preferable. Can the intake be done at her house since she doesn't have childcare right now? That's a great way of pivoting and saying, since you can't leave the kids home alone, can we bring, kind of the office to you so that you're not in this situation? And what could you do next time you might be in this situation if they're less flexible? Yeah, asking if the neighbors can be with them, not just keep an eye on them, which is very vague. You can reschedule the appointment and say, hey, these are the child safety and neglect and protection laws. Let's reschedule for when you have childcare, when Garrett is home. Yeah, get a well-rounded perspective, not assuming that Johanna's neglectful, but saying you may not know this. This is what we need to do in this country. Absolutely. There may be many other options for childcare available and informing about future effects that they could be reported on if this continues and that we need to change the behavior now. Great work. So, I want to talk about involving clients in reporting if safe and possible. Determining whether it's safe and appropriate is important part of the situation, which would mean reminding the clients that you're a mandated reporter, letting them know you'll be reporting, and you could offer to include them in the reporting process. But if you believe that doing that threatens your safety or the safety of the person who you're reporting about, you should not disclose that information in this moment. If it is safe and possible, some advantages is that it can really empower clients, dispel certain fears about child welfare authorities, that this is a collaborative process, that we're trying to protect a child or a vulnerable adult together. It can also, in a report, actually show authorities the client is looking for help, they want to change, they want to protect their child, they're not adversarial, and that can make the process also less adversarial or antagonistic. However, some disadvantages, definitely if it could be dangerous to the caseworker or the clients, or as someone mentioned in the pastor case, that it could create antagonism and mistrust if you involve them, if you talk to them about this. And so if you feel that, if you know that you need to report because of your legal mandate, but it would not support your relationship in trying to support the children or the vulnerable adult, it's not a good idea to tell them that you're reporting or to involve them. It can also be against state protocols or agency practices, depending on the situation. Again, if it's made unsafe. So you're going to make sure you want to know that within your own context. Clients can always decline involvement in reporting, and that shouldn't be seen as anything beyond, oh, I thought you would want to help report so that they can see you're non-adversarial. That might still be really scary to clients. They're not required to be a part of their reporting. They are not mandated reporters. You are mandated reporters. So if you explain to them the advantages, you decide that's safe, and they say, no, thank you, I'd rather you make the report. There's no penalty for that or anything about that in the case, and you make the report yourself. After you make a report, a situation could temporarily become more dangerous for a client because an investigator comes, an abuser is angry about that. You want to try to support the client in receiving the care and resources they need, recognizing things might be unstable for a bit. We're trying to help you get the safety and stability you need. That might not happen right away, but really trying to help them stay safe and stable, trying not to create more fear or friction as much as possible. If the person you've reported about is also a client, they still are eligible for your services. You need to remain professional and supportive with everyone involved. So, of course, very understandable if you're angry that someone has been abusing their children. They're not immediately disqualified from all of their services. You don't need to be friends, but certainly remain professional and supportive in other ways. Again, in that shared knowledge that we're trying to support child or vulnerable adult safety and well-being, our duty is to continue serving, to not just cut off ties and try to keep channels of communication open so we can better the situation for everyone. However, if you feel unsafe because you've reported and the existing protections aren't sufficient to kind of uh, take care of you or keep you safe, make sure to tell your supervisor right away to get support from your agency. You absolutely should not be made unsafe because of doing your legal duty. And that may be also involving law enforcement authorities if that feels right and is appropriate. I'm going to touch very briefly on safety planning. We have really fantastic resources on safety planning, which Jasmine's going to drop a couple of in the chat and are in the slides. So we won't dive in too much to this here, but I do want you to be aware that safety planning might be warranted if the risk to a client's safety is ongoing or increased, especially after a report. If both the victim and the offender are clients, so how are we keeping client information safe in case notes? So if the offender has access to the case notes in the same way that the victim would, having a separate case note, working on these protocols with your supervisor, making sure if office workers feel endangered because of a report or ongoing abuse, and if they feel less safe in their community, that they're also given the opportunity to safety plan. So really important to work on safety plans before something escalates or gets worse. So we're going to go to our last case scenario. I want you to meet Farzana. Farzana is a woman from Afghanistan who has recently arrived and moved in with her cousin, who is also her US tie. In your most recent home visit, Farzana tells you privately she cannot stand how her cousin and his wife treat their adult son with disabilities. She says the parents often punish their son for urinary incontinence by locking him in the closet or withholding his dinner. She says she has never seen the family physically strike him, but he sometimes cries and moans from the closet. Farzana reports otherwise feeling safe and comfortable in the home. So for our last Slido question of today's presentation, how can you support Farzana as well as the family, even though they are not your clients? Offering resources. So telling the family, how can we support you in better supporting your son? They don't have to be your clients to report. And you can do those things at the same time. You report right away and provide the education. Hi, I've heard about this situation. I want to make sure that you know there's resources for folks who have disabilities, for families who are caregivers. Yep, suspicion of abuse, absolutely. They could be stressed. So, how can I support you in finding resources to be less stressed while emphasizing this is not an appropriate way? Um, uh, this is not an appropriate way to treat your son. Absolutely. Yeah, I like that. Offer community resources while reporting, offering therapy and education while reporting. Farzana might be at risk of retaliation, so exploring backup housing options while reporting. Absolutely. So in this case, I think it's a good idea to let Farzana know you have to make this report or a report will be made. And how can you support her in finding safe housing if there's some kind of retaliation? Providing resources that point to services to assist in the area. Absolutely. So you all are really hitting on it that um, wonderful. there's multiple channels that we're supporting. Yeah, helping with cultural differences about disabled folks, folks with disabilities. That's a really great point. What are some culturally specific resources, support groups with other parents dealing with this, where they can help each other in a culturally sensitive way in their own language. Um, can the child find a better situation if they have an SSDA benefit? Absolutely. This is getting more in the weeds, but this is all stuff that you could do or refer them to people who could help them think through these things. So really want to thank you for your active engagement today. The little bit of time for questions, Jasmine has let me know of a couple of which have come through. I think an important one is you're not mandated to report about adults experiencing interpersonal violence in the home. You may be, if a child has witnessed it and that's considered abuse in the home, but you can always offer support to people, ask them what they want to do. Part of this is that we're trying to protect children and vulnerable people who don't have their full ability to achieve self-determination, to make choices for themselves or protect themselves. And that's why mandatory reporting is about them, to protect them. But we want to make sure that folks who are experiencing other kinds of abuse are given the options to make empowered decisions about their lives, to try to better their situation in whatever way they see as fit. And really working with people, even if you are a mandated reporter in that case, to find what's kind of best for them within the confines of the law to support themselves. What safety tips are recommended for a case manager to take after reporting if the clients conclude it was the case manager reported? Make sure you're keeping your documentation private and comprehensive, but without extra details. So kind of your good case noting practices, which is other resources we have here at Switchboard. Write enough, but not too much. Make sure to consult with your manager if you think it's unsafe to continue working with the family or if you need further support. Really remember, you're not in this alone. How can we continue to support people in today's kind of dangerous or unstable environment with where refugees and newcomers have a lot of fears and anxieties? How can we already support already vulnerable populations? It can be difficult to balance our desire to protect clients with the responsibility to report. We're truly always trying to do all of these things to protect clients. I want to say again, child welfare agencies are meant to protect vulnerable children, and so are adult protective services. They're not meant to engage in immigration enforcement. It's important to work with the appropriate agency to make the reports and think about how we can all work together to protect kids and vulnerable adults. Allow these experts to support in that shared mission. How do we talk to our clients to feel safe and open up, and how far can we move forward? Building trust with clients takes time. We try to create safety over time. So if they feel comfortable sharing with you and being supported by you in a report, that's wonderful. Again, it's not our role to force a disclosure or make someone repeat a painful or traumatic disclosure. It's not your failing if someone didn't disclose to you that something was happening and you weren't able to witness any indicators. But we're trying to create the supportive environment where they have several channels of places they can go to get that support and find the help that they need. How will a vulnerable senior benefit from a report being made? Adult protective services can support vulnerable seniors and investigate to see what services and changes that senior may need to stay safe or move into a safer situation. Similar to what someone put in that last slide, maybe the family doesn't know there are other benefits available to that would create a better living situation for that son with disabilities. Really great question we got about differences with virtual case management. It's still really important to report if you receive a disclosure virtually or if you witness indicators of abuse and neglect on a virtual platform. You would still give all the information you have available to the reporting agency in virtual practice. Um, uh, And you're going to want to always ask where someone is located if you're doing a virtual case management meeting. So if there's an emergency or you need to make a report, you have that information available for authorities or 911. But it's okay to say when you're making the report, there are details you're not privy to because it's a virtual relationship or you've never met them in person. We're going to be having an upcoming webinar at Switchboard on remote case management. And there's two great guides on virtual safety. I'm going to pop in the chat here that I hope you check out. That Sorry, those are two different links on virtual safety. What happens if an agency doesn't believe your report? Your job, again, is not to investigate, it's to provide the information you gathered or were told, not to necessarily verify the accuracy. The agency that investigates will do its due diligence to investigate and find out what's going on. If you think there's been a problem or there's still an egregious issue, follow up directly with that agency, maybe ask again to speak to a supervisor. Um, if you think something went wrong. Are there barriers preventing children or their families from disclosing or reporting, and what might be possible solutions? So we're always trying to provide information about what appropriate behavior is. If a child or family thinks they're experiencing something dangerous or harmful, we're hoping that um, uh, we're hoping that you're creating the opportunity for them to ask about that, to find help if they think they need help. Um, Trying again to create trust so that they might disclose to you or just come ask you for help or look for other services that you've mentioned that might be able to support their situation. So I think we'll pause on questions for here. You all had some really great questions. We hope now that you're able, we're going to go back to our slides and review our learning objectives. We hope that you're able to describe key principles of mandatory reporting in reportable situations, such as abuse and neglect of children and vulnerable adults. Identify who may be a mandatory reporter and possible steps of the reporting process. Integrate special considerations for working across cultures with newcomers in the mandatory reporting context, and apply client-centered and trauma-informed principles to maintain client confidentiality and trust while upholding mandatory reporting responsibilities. So we will be sending the slides out within 24 hours and the recording will be posted to the website. Here are just some of those recommended resources. Again, there are a lot more embedded in that first toolkit on sample scripts on how you can reach different reporters. There's the accompanying guide. We have some great tools on family violence and safety planning. Really encourage you to check those out. Now it's time to receive your free 1.5 continuing education credits, which you can use to maintain your existing licensure. So you can scan that QR code, or Jasmine has put the link in the chat. You're going to be asked to complete a quick assessment, objectives check-in, and a satisfaction survey to get your CEs from Switchboard totally for free. If you're not already logged into our Switchboard learning platform, you'll need to create a quick free account and then take that assessment. Even if you don't want your CEs, you can skip those first two steps within there. And we really love for you to take out the feedback survey, or known as the training satisfaction survey. We really do review those and try to improve our trainings and all other future offerings. So I'm going to stop talking for a moment so you can work on completing those evaluations. Really want to make sure that we get your feedback and that we can give you your continuing education credits, which are well earned. Well, in our final minute here, I want to thank you again for learning with Switchboard. I want to thank Rebecca and Jasmine for supporting such a smooth webinar. Please stay connected with us, follow us on LinkedIn, go to our website and browse our many resources on this and many other topics. And we'd love to hear from you if you have technical assistance requests or further questions about this presentation. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.